Opportunities that look divine are not always divine opportunities. Welcome to the Daily Devo. I am Vince Miller. So yesterday, David escaped to the strongholds of Engedi. Saul pursued him with 3,000 soldiers and then exposed himself by relieving himself in the cave where David was hiding. So I want to catch up next and see what happens in verses 4 through 7. Before I do, there's a new drop of that Vince Miller show below. You want to check that out. We drop new episodes every Monday. I hope you'll enjoy them and share them with your friends. But here's the text for today, verses 4 through 7. And the men of David said to him, probably whispering to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and then you shall do to him as it seems good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Notice it wasn't because he crawled up behind a man who was squatting and relieving himself. And then he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand." There's that word again, hand. "My power against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. 3 critical moments in this story teach one valuable lesson about spiritual leadership. So here are the key moments. First, misinterpreted messages. Of course, David's men confidently whisper to David that this is his divine opportunity. They apply an earlier declaration that God had made about the Philistines in Keilah, that is back in chapter 23, just one chapter back, verse 4, and then they apply that promise to the present situation, but it's applied wrongly. David's men saw a divine opportunity to do something less than divine and altered God's message to match the present moment. Now, I do have to say this, we've all been guilty of doing something like this. It's easy to misinterpret or selfishly interpret promises of God when our emotions are heightened or we kind of feel cornered. And the message in our minds can be louder than the messages in God's word. Second, we see this stealthy sword. So with remarkable stealth, David manages to sneak up behind Saul while he's in a very vulnerable moment, literally with his pants down. And then he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. And we cannot gloss over the fact that David's sword was incredibly sharp. We assume he still has Goliath's sword, and his approach is pretty stealthy too, by the way. Yet instead of using the sword to chop off Saul's head, as he had done with Goliath, with that same sword, he cut off a corner of his garment. Very interesting. The deep conviction, though, that struck David was powerful enough that it stopped him in his tracks. And I really believe this required incredible emotional restraint and faith in God. In moments when we hold power in our hands, it's critical to remember that great power is demonstrated in restraint and faith when we act according to God's will and not our own. Third, we hear this confronting counsel. So David crawls back, and he speaks to his men about his conviction. He realizes that cutting Saul's robe, while small in comparison to actually cutting off his head, was still dishonoring the Lord's anointed. So David tore into his men. That's literally what it says in the Hebrew text. He tore into them with a strong rebuke. His allies counseled him to act, and David confronted their counsel. Sometimes our closest allies can counsel us toward choices that maybe seem good, but violate God's will. In those moments, we need to have courage to question and confront ungodly counsel, even when it seems reasonable and maybe even justified. Here's my point today. Opportunities that look divine are not always divine. Opportunities that look divine might not be divine. Opportunities are just opportunities with 2 different results, a godly result and an ungodly result. In threatening or emotional moments, I think it's really tempting to see divine moments that are not a divine moment. It is simply a selfish moment, sometimes deceptively portrayed as divine. And this makes me wonder that when David, when he was crawling up behind Saul, if he looked down at Goliath's sword, assuming it was, he saw his reflection and he began to think to himself, should I use the sword God gave me to cut down the enemy of God's anointed, to actually cut down God's anointed? Should I use this sword that God gave me to cut down and to cut off the head of an enemy of God, to actually cut down God's anointed? You know, as you are given opportunities today to lead, I want you to be cautious, especially when you are emotionally heightened or you feel cornered. You might be given an opportunity to do something divine or less than divine. Then just do God's will, not your own, because spiritual leadership is only spiritual leadership when it's spiritually aligned with God's will. I love you guys. I pray this has blessed you. If it has, share it with someone else. And I'll see you right back here again tomorrow.